Welcome to another far-reaching conversation. All right, let's jump right in with subpart 4.1, contract execution.
Okay.
This is all about making those contracts official and legally binding.
And the FAR is crystal clear on one thing only contracting officers can sign on behalf of the U.S. government.
So no rogue employees signing off on deals. Got it. But what's interesting is there's a specific way they have to sign.
Absolutely. Their name and title have to be typed, stamped, or printed right there on the contract.
That makes sense. It leaves no room for doubt. Now let's talk about organization.
That's where subpart 4.10 comes in, the uniform use of line items.
So how does the FAR want us to structure those line items?
Well, each deliverable, meaning the thing you're actually providing, needs its own line item. But to qualify, it has to meet 5 specific criteria.
5. Okay, lay it on me.
First, it needs to be separately identifiable.
Okay.
For supplies, that could mean having a unique national stock number or a manufacturer's part number. It also needs a single unit price or total price, a single accounting classification, separate delivery details like schedule and destination, and a single contract pricing type.
Wait, a single pricing type? What does that mean?
It means everything in that line item has to be either fixed price or cost reimbursement.
Okay.
You can't mix and match within a single line item.
So each line item is like its own mini contract with its own set of rules?
Right.
Now, I've heard of these things called subline items. What are those all about?
Subline items are a way to break down the main line item into smaller chunks. They can be deliverable, meaning they describe a physical thing, or informational, meaning they provide additional details.
Can you give me an example?
Let's say you're buying office chairs. You might have a line item for chairs, and then subline items for different sizes or colors.
Okay.
Those would be deliverable subline item.
Okay, that makes sense. What about an informational subline item?
Maybe a subline item specifies the delivery date for each color chair.
Right.
That's not a separate deliverable, but it's important information related to the chairs.
So subline items add another layer of detail and help you track everything effectively.
Exactly. They're all about making contract management easier and more transparent.
All right, next up we have subpart 4.11, the System for Award Management, better known as SAM.gov.
You could say that it's a central hub where vendors can register and showcase their capabilities to the government.
So is registration in SAM.gov always a must-have?
For the most part, yes. There are a few exceptions, like really small purchases.
Okay.
Classified contracts or situations where it's truly an emergency.
But even in those emergency cases, they still have to register eventually, right?
Absolutely. Within 30 days of getting that contract, they need to be in SAM.gov.
Wow.
And it's not just a one-time thing. Contractors have to keep their information updated.
What happens if they don't?
Well, there can be serious consequences. Mismatched information could delay payments or even prevent them from being awarded future contracts.
Ouch, that's a big incentive to keep everything up to date.
Definitely. And speaking of SAM.gov, there's a really interesting feature called the Disaster Response Registry.
That sounds important. What is that?
It's a special list of contractors who can jump in and provide services during emergencies, like hurricanes or earthquakes.
Let's move on to subpart 4.16. Unique Procurement Instrument Identifiers. That's a mouthful.
It's all about giving every document a unique fingerprint, so the government can track everything efficiently.
Makes sense. So walk us through what a PID looks like and what all those numbers and letters actually mean.
Okay, so a PID has 13 to 17 characters, a mix of letters and numbers, and each section represents specific information.
Okay.
The first 6 characters are the Activity Address Code, or AAC.
AAC, what's that?
It identifies the specific department, agency, and office that's issuing the contract.
So right off the bat, you know who's in charge, what's next.
Then you have the fiscal year, which is just the last 2 digits of the year the contract was issued after that. There's a single letter that tells you what type of document it is, like a contract, purchase order, or blanket purchase agreement. And finally, there's a unique number assigned by the issuing agency, which can be anywhere from 4 to 8 characters long.
So if we put it all together, a PID might look something like ABCD 1225C 12234, right?
You got ABCD 12 would be the AAC, 25 is for fiscal year 2025, C means it's a contract, and 1234 is the unique number. It's all about transparency and accountability.
Speaking of accountability, let's talk about subpart 4.6 contract reporting.
Okay.
So what does the FAR say about reporting on contracts?
Transparency is key. The FAR requires certain contract actions to be reported to the Federal Procurement Data System,
Okay.
or FPDS.
Okay, but what's the point of all this reporting? What does FPDS actually do?
It's a powerful tool for keeping tabs on government spending. It helps create reports for Congress, the Government Accountability Office, and even the public.
So it's about making sure taxpayer dollars are being used wisely. What kinds of things need to be reported?
There are three main categories. First, you have definitive contracts, which include purchase orders above a certain dollar amount.
So any contract that's set in stone with clear terms and conditions, what's next?
Then you have indefinite delivery vehicles, or IDVs.
Okay.
These are things like task orders, GSA schedules, blanket purchase agreements, and basic ordering agreements.
So they're more like frameworks for future purchases rather than a one-time contract.
Exactly. And the third category is all the calls and orders awarded under those IDVs. Basically, anything that leads to a purchase needs to be tracked and reported.
So if you spend government money, it's getting logged somewhere. Are there any exceptions to this rule? Do we have to report everything?
There are a few exceptions. For example, really small purchases,
Okay.
orders from GSA stock, or purchases from special programs like Ability One don't need to be reported.
Okay, that makes sense. It would be overkill to track every paperclip, and I'm assuming classified information stays classified, right?
Absolutely. Protecting sensitive information is paramount.
All right, that brings us to our final stop for this part of our conversation. Subpart 4.8 Government Contract Files.
Okay.
This is where all that important contract information gets stored right.
Exactly. Think of contract files as a complete history of each transaction from start to finish.
Okay, so what kinds of things go into these files? Give me the highlights.
There are actually different types of files, each with a specific purpose. You have contracting office files, which hold everything related to selecting the contractor and awarding the contract.
Okay.
Things like the initial request justifications, offers, and any modifications.
And that's where you find all the nitty-gritty details of the award process. What else?
Then you have contract administration office files. These contain all the documents related to managing the contract once it's been awarded. Things like security requirements, performance bond details,
Okay.
and any correspondence about the contractor's performance.
So that's where you track the day-to-day management of the contract.
Right. And lastly, you have paying office files, which focus on the financial side of things.
Okay.
Invoices, vouchers, payment records, that sort of thing.
So we've got files for awarding the contract, managing the contract, and paying the contractor.
You got it. It's all about keeping everything organized and transparent.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, at some point, these contracts come to an end, right? So when can we finally close those files and move on?
Well, the general rule is that files for simpler contracts can be closed once the contracting officer has proof of delivery and final payment.
Okay.
For more complex contracts, it might take longer, depending on the type of contract
Right.
and whether there are any outstanding issues to resolve.
But there are some exceptions, right?
Absolutely. If there's a dispute or a legal issue, you can't close the file until that's resolved. And if a contract is terminated, you have to wait until all the termination actions are completed.
So there are safeguards in place to make sure everything is wrapped up properly before closing the book on a contract.
Exactly. It's all about following the rules and maintaining accountability.
So let's pick up where we left off and talk more about closing out those contract files. It's not as simple as just throwing everything in a drawer and forgetting about it, right?
Definitely not. There's a whole process to follow, and it all starts with the Contract Administration Office.
Okay.
Once they have proof that the contract's been physically completed, meaning all the deliverables have been provided, they kick off the closeout process.
So it's not just about the paperwork. It's about making sure the actual work is done. What happens next?
Well, they have to review the funds and see if there's any money left over that can be deobligated.
Makes sense. We don't want any loose ends with the budget.
Right, and there's a whole checklist of things they need to make sure are taken care of, like what happens to any classified material,
Right.
clearing those final patent and royalty reports,
Uh-huh.
and making sure there aren't any outstanding value engineering change proposals.
Value engineering change proposals. What are those?
They're suggestions from the contractor on how to improve the product or service being delivered under the contract. Sometimes these suggestions can save the government money or lead to a better outcome.
What else is on that checklist?
They also need to receive those plant and property clearance reports.
Okay.
This makes sure the government gets back any equipment or property that was provided to the contractor for the project.
Right. We don't want any government laptops going missing.
Exactly. And then they need to make sure all the costs are settled.
Okay.
This includes any interim or disallowed costs.
Right.
Basically, any expenses that weren't approved up front. And of course, any price revisions need to be finalized.
Hmm.
Sometimes the cost of a contract can change over time due to unforeseen circumstances or changes in the scope of work. We can't forget about the contract audit. This is where an independent auditor comes in and checks the contractor's books to make sure everything is above board.
So it's an extra layer of oversight to prevent fraud and abuse.
Exactly, and once the audit's complete, the contractor has to submit a closing statement. This is basically their final report on how they performed under the contract.
So it's their chance to wrap things up and say, mission accomplished.
You could say that, and then finally, the contractor submits their final invoice,
Okay.
and the government reviews everything and makes the final payment. Once all those steps are verified, the contracting officer who managed the contract prepares a very important document called a contract completion statement.
Okay, tell me more about this statement. What does it include?
It summarizes all the key details of the contract, who the contracting and contract administration offices were, the contract number,
Okay.
the last modification and call or order number, who the contractor was, how much money was spent, and any excess funds.
Sounds comprehensive, but what's the most important part of this statement?
The contracting officer has to declare that all the required administrative actions have been completed successfully. They sign and date the statement, and that's their official sign-off.
So it's like the final stamp of approval. Where does this statement go once it's prepared?
The original goes into the contracting office's contract file, and if there was a separate contract administration office, they get a copy too.
So it's official documentation that the contract is closed out and everything is squared away.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've covered the steps involved in closing out a contract file. What happens next? Do we just shove those files in a dusty basement and forget about them?
Not quite. We have to talk about storage, handling, and disposal of contract files. I know more record keeping.
But this is important stuff. You need to know where to find things and how long to keep them.
Exactly. Agencies have to follow specific procedures for handling, storing, and eventually getting rid of contract files. And these procedures have to account for all the different ways we store records these days.
It's not just paper files anymore, right?
Right. We have electronic files, microfilm, and who knows what the future holds. The key is that no matter the format, we have to be able to find and retrieve the information accurately and completely. And there are rules about how long different types of records need to be kept.
So tell me, how long do we need to keep these contract files around?
Well, most contracts and related documents, including proposals, have to be kept for 6 years after the final payment. But there are some exceptions. For example, contractor payrolls for construction contracts only have to be kept for 3 years after the contract is completed, unless there's an ongoing investigation or legal issue.
And what about unsolicited proposals that the government didn't accept?
Those are handled according to each agency's own procedures, so can vary. But files for canceled solicitations have to be kept for 6 years after the cancellation, and any extra copies of procurement file records that are used for administrative purposes can be disposed of once they're no longer needed.
So there are different time frames depending on the type of record.
Exactly, and there are a few other types of records with specific retention periods. Documents related to the contractor in general, like their management systems or past performance, are kept until they're outdated or replaced with newer information data submitted to them. The FPDS has to be kept for 6 years after it's submitted.
Okay.
And any files related to investigations, lawsuits, or protests are kept until the matter is resolved.
So if there's a dispute over a contract, you might need to hold on to those files for quite a while.
Precisely. It's always best to err on the side of caution and consult with your agency's records management experts if you have any questions.
That's great advice.
Remember, these retention periods are set by the National Archives and Records Administration, so it's important to follow their guidelines and any specific procedures your agency has in place.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about contract execution, line items, SAM.gov, PIIDs, contract reporting, and contract files. It's been a whirlwind tour of FAR, Part 4, Administrative and Information Matters.
We've given you a solid foundation to build on.
And, most importantly, we've hopefully shown you that this stuff isn't as dry and boring as it might seem at first glance.
It's all about making sure the government gets what it needs, taxpayers are protected, and contractors are treated fairly.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So for anyone who's ready to reach far and take their government contracting knowledge to the next level, be sure to check out Acquisition.gov. And if you find these podcasts helpful, then reach far for that subscribe button.